This is Homesteading Lesson 2, the Homestead Act. And both of these videos are our reading lessons for today that go along with our chapter that we read yesterday, Pa Goes to Town. One of the things Pa would have been doing when he went to town for the first time was to stake their claim with the local land government, which was part of the federal government, in the town of Independence, Kansas, that would have marked on a big map their 160 acres that they're going to live on and hopefully prove up so that they can claim that land and they would get it for free. There was a filing fee, as we're going to see. You should have watched the video about homesteading. It talked a little bit about the Homestead Act, but it showed a lot of great footage of what it was like to live as a homesteader and things that they faced, especially here in Nebraska. So you should have this paper. It should be with your little house stuff. It has the Homestead Act, and then that on the front, and then on the back, more activities to fill in. And we have a sod house and a log cabin, which are two of the most common houses. So we're going to talk about and fill those out together as we learn more about what Pa and Ma were doing, living in the prairie, the plains of Kansas, and what you saw in the video, many thousands and thousands of people were trying to do in Nebraska. You also saw that it turned out to be very, very difficult, and very few people were able to make it for the full time, and that will include Ma and Pa. However, they're going to not be able to prove up for a totally different reason. I think they probably would have made it. So if we will flip to the back side, I want you to find the part that says, "What is it?" And it says, with much of the blank coast of the America already developed, the United States government wanted to encourage people to move out blank. They decided to help people out by offering them free blank through a law called the Homestead Act. And in that particular section, we're going to write east, west, and land. So you write those down. So with much of the east coast of America already developed, the United States government wanted to encourage people to move out west. They decided to help people out by offering them free land through a law called the Homestead Act. All right, and then we're going to go on and do the next section that tells us a little bit more about the law. President Abraham Lincoln, so this is a law that goes back to 1860 when he becomes president, signed a law in 1862 called the Homestead Act. U.S. citizens 21 and older could get, as I've said many times, 160 acres of unoccupied land west of the Mississippi River and east of the Rocky Mountains. Eventually that will spread. The land was free as long as they lived on the land for 5 years and made improvements to the land. So those are our next ones to write down. Now, that would encompass the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, Arizona, Nevada, California, Colorado, Utah, not California at this time, Utah, Wyoming, and Montana. Eventually, that will spread all the way to the West Coast, and Washington and Oregon and California will also be used under the Homestead Act, will be settled. Eventually, Alaska will be bought from the Russian government, and it will become a homestead state. There are also states that are east of the Mississippi, especially way down in the south, that were acquired, and we wanted to get them settled. Florida is actually a homestead state as well. And some of those states that were occupied by Native Americans rather than white settlers who owned slaves. So, who qualified for all of this land? Who could go and get 160 acres, which is a lot of land, to live on? Homesteading was a great opportunity for many people, especially poor people. And there were many people, as you saw in the video, who came from across the ocean in Europe, and then or people who never would be able to afford any land in the eastern part of the United States. It cost too much, and they had to rent. Homesteading was a great opportunity for many people, especially immigrants just moving to the United States. Anyone who was over 21 years of age could own land. This included former slaves, this included immigrants, and it even included single women, which is one of the first times in the United States that women could own land. So as long as you were 21, even if you'd been a slave before the Civil War was over, and if you were a woman by yourself, you now could have land if you could make it on the land for 5 years and prove up. And we're going to learn about what prove up is towards the end of this. So that led a lot of people to want to get land. And different areas of the country did all kinds of different Hey. No, I don't think so. I've got chicken thawing that needs to be cooked, and then I'll make it into chicken salad. So you're just heading home? Okay. I'll see you in a little bit. I love you. All right, bye. All right, I hope that worked okay. You may have listened to a phone call I took. I hope not. Um, got people to come to the land in different ways. Different areas of land were opened up to homesteading at different times. And the land that Ma and Pa were going to was supposed to open up very soon, the southern part of Kansas and then all the way down through Oklahoma. And they wanted to get there early so they could get their best land, and then they could go and file. And this was called, created land rushes. And we're going to learn about one in particular, where people would hurry in to claim the best plots of land. And that is kind of what Ma and Pa are. They're kind of rushing in a little early. Pa's heard from the government that they're going to open that land and that he can get there and it's going to be in this area. And if he stakes out his area, he'll be one of the first people to claim a stake in that area, and he'll be able to pick the best land. So land rushes and best. And there are even people that would sneak in and move other people's stakes that mark the edges of their plots, or steal them. There were land grabbers. And do you remember the two men that lived in the cabin that Pa visited towards the beginning of the book? And they built one cabin on the line, and they lived on opposite sides, but they cooked in the middle, and they both had their farms going out. They were brothers, and they wanted their farms to be right next to each other. So that's how they took care of that, so they didn't have to build two houses in an area, as you saw in the video, where there wasn't a whole lot of trees. So they were building that there. So one particularly famous land rush happened in Oklahoma shortly after Ma and Pa have homesteaded. And they decided that they were going to make everyone wait until they had this one time, and they were going to tell them they could go and ride their horses as fast as they could and find their land. Now, a lot of people went in early and kind of marked where they thought they wanted to be. They just had to beat everybody else there with their horses. So it's like a great big horse race. It was really kind of scary. I understand there were people that died and horses that got trampled because everybody was mad to get to the area that they wanted to. And this happened in the spring. It's called the Sooners. In the spring of 1889, and I hope that sounds familiar to you, there was a major land rush when 50,000 people lined up to claim about, let's see, 2 million acres of land. When the people were allowed to enter the land, many had snuck in early, like I was telling you, to claim the best land first. Later, these people were nicknamed Sooners because they went in too soon. And currently, the University of Oklahoma's mascot is the Sooner. Now, you guys are kind of young that you probably don't remember when Nebraska played in the Big 12 conference, and before that it was called the Big 8 conference, and Oklahoma University was one of our giant rivals, and the mascot that run out on the field is a wagon, a covered wagon, drawn by horses, and people run next to it and lead it, and it says Sooners on it, and it has OU on the side, and so that's their mascot for the University of Oklahoma, and it all dates back to this really, really dangerous event to claim land. So on the back, you have interesting facts about the Homestead Act, and these are kind of interesting. In the first one, some of this was in the video, but not all of it. Northerners wanted the land to be developed by small farmers rather than the large plantation owners from the South. And they were afraid that those plantation owners would use slaves to farm this land. So this is all part of the disagreement over this during the Civil War. So the people who lived in the North wanted as many small farmers from the North or immigrants coming from the United States or former slaves acting on their own or single women to get the land. They were afraid that a lot of the southern plantation owners, which were huge, huge farms, would be grabbed up by these plantation owners, and they'd put 4 or 5 of them together and have even bigger land out here, and then they would bring slaves in when we were trying to fight to free all of the slaves. So that was a big problem. I said there was a filing fee, so it says there was a $18 fee to file the application to get a plot of land. Now, for us, when we buy a house and the property that the house sits on, and then we have to pay taxes every year to the city that we live in, to run the city, we pay a lot more money than that. $18 sounds like nothing. It's less than a $20 bill. But you have to remember, in the 1860s, those people, one, didn't deal in money a lot. We've learned about trading, a lot of trading, and they had to save that money up forever. These are people that are too poor to buy their own land, so they saved and saved and saved until they had $18, traded for the goods they needed to get to this land, and it was a big deal to be able to pay the filing fee. But then if you lived there for 5 years, you could have the land for free. So $18 was a great investment, and it meant a lot to those people. That was a lot of money as far as they were concerned. Later Homestead Acts, the law would continue to open up new land, as I talked about, allowed for 320 acres for dry land farming, and for ranching it was 640 acres. So as they discovered, not all of the land that they were opening up was good land, and the farmers wanted to get to the good land. Of course, a good land was land that had water. That would be essential to living and farming. They wanted land that was flat, and they wanted land that had trees on it. That left a lot of area in the middle part of the Plain States in North and South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, into Oklahoma and Texas, and especially like Arizona and Nevada, kind of out in the cold. You know, people didn't want to live there. It was dry, there wasn't rivers, You had to dig down miles to get to the water underground. So they upped the amount of land you could get. So for $18, you could get 320 acres, which was double the good land, and live there and prove up. That was hard to do, but you could get 320 acres, which is a ton. And then they realized that a lot of the land in Montana and Wyoming, in particular, and in Colorado and Utah, was really good for ranching. But 160 acres is not a lot of land to keep cattle on. So they upped that to 640 acres that you could get that much, so that they had enough land for their cattle to run. By 1934, and the Homestead Act ran all the way through the early 1980s, over 100 years you could get free land. By 1934, 270 million acres of land had been given away by the United States government. And that is about 10% of our entire land in the United States. About 10%. So now remember that of the 270 million acres, those are only the people that were successful. There's millions and millions and millions of acres that people couldn't make it work, weren't able to stay there. That reverted back to the government. Eventually it was made, sold as smaller portions of land, and became towns and other small farms and things like that. Homesteading ended in 1976, even though I know there were homesteaders well into the 80s, except in Alaska. That's why, where it ended in 1986. So homesteading in the lower 48 states ended in 1976, and it continued into Alaska until 1986. In the book Little House on the Prairie that we're reading right now, Laura Ingalls' dad claims a homestead in Kansas. And I don't know if your parents ever watched the show. It's an Alaskan show on one of the Discovery channels. I think it's called Homesteaders or Life in Alaska or something like that. And it follows the life of a group of people living in Alaska. It's a family whose ancestors, well, not their ancestors, actually the older men in the show, were one of those later homesteaders that got land in Alaska when in the 60s, and they still live there on their homesteads. So it's kind of fun to watch that. They're not exactly like the homesteaders in the 1800s because they have modern tools and machines and boats and trucks and cars, but they've been there the whole time. So it's kind of fun to watch that. So there is homesteading. And that is all the background we would have learned about before we went to Homestead National Monument in Beatrice and visited the national park there to homesteading, because the land that the park sits on west of Beatrice is where the very first homestead in the entire country happened, right after the law went into effect in 1862. The man who got that land settled there as the first stake your claim and settled up, and that became the monument after his family left that to the Park Service after he died.